Welcome. This is D.L. Hughes from VelocityWriting.com, where you learn to write with speed, passion, purpose, and profitability. How popular is Jack London today? Does his writing style have anything to offer to writers? Well, his work does have staying power. London is still studied in high schools and colleges, and in 2020, Harrison Ford starred in a movie of London's Call of the Wild, which was one of his most famous stories. Now, this video about Jack London is a subscriber request. If you have a suggestion for a writing video that you'd like to see, put it in the comments section below. Let's get into Jack London right now. If you're new here, please subscribe. Also, click on the bell for notifications. I have expanded bonus content on this topic on VelocityWriting.com. See the direct link to the blog post in the YouTube description. Here are a few facts about Jack London to give these writing tips some context. He was born in 1876 in San Francisco and grew up in Oakland, just east across the bay. He died at age 40 in 1916 at his ranch in Sonoma County, just north of San Francisco. Now, London didn't just hang around the San Francisco area, however. Among other travels, he went to the Yukon in search of gold, was a correspondent in the 1904 Russian-Japanese War, and he traveled widely throughout the South Pacific aboard his yacht, the Snark. Jack London was an ardent socialist. London would have been very much at home among today's left-wing radicals. He declared himself a socialist and supported socialist causes. London didn't write "Sincerely Yours" when he ended a letter. He wrote "Yours for the Revolution" over his signature. Now, he was a big supporter of the environment and animal rights. But London's progressive socialist agenda made him a champion of eugenics. Even though he was supposedly an abortion survivor, according to his mother, London advocated eugenics. That is the selective breeding of humans to improve the quality of the population. In a practical sense, that meant killing or sterilizing mental and physical defectives and criminals. Now, Jack London believed in eugenics so much that he married his first wife because he thought she would make good breeding stock. He disliked her, according to all reports, and he divorced her soon after their second daughter was born. He remarried for love, but had no children with his second wife. Jack London was an apparent racist. That was part of the socialist progressive agenda as well. Now, this is odd since his birth mother gave baby Jack over to a neighbor woman named Jenny Prentice to be wet nursed, and she ended up raising the boy almost as her own. Later, she was the one who put up the money that allowed London to buy the oyster pirating ship, the Razzle Dazzle, and that single act triggered all of London's seafaring adventures and his writing career. So who was Jenny Prentice? Other than London's beloved foster mother? Well, she was a black woman, a freed slave, who had moved to San Francisco after the Civil War. Most of London's racial animus was aimed at the Yellow Peril. In a 1910 story he wrote, he advocated biological warfare against China to wipe them out before they took over the world. Now, before we look at his writing style and what we can learn from it, let me tell you how he died. That adds context too. He, unfortunately, was a roaring drunk most of his life. The question is whether he died of acute alcoholism at age 40 or if he committed suicide by purposely overdosing on morphine. In his autobiography written 3 years before his death, he fantasizes about suicide. In one of his last novels, he portrays morphine as the preferred method of suicide. Either way, he sadly died in a dissipated state of body and mind after just a 22-year writing career. What writing tips can Jack London offer us? Well, first of all, they come from his life rather than the explicit tips I'll discuss later. The first thing that stands out is that London was a self-taught writer. He had a high school education, but he did attend the University of California at Berkeley for a few months before dropping out. But he had no formal literary training. Because he was self-taught, he had a very naturalistic style. He simply wrote what he saw and heard. He came to writing with few preconceived notions, and he was fortunate that people of his time favorably responded to this kind of writing. His most popular writing was on the theme of man against nature. He had real-life experiences both in the Yukon and in the South Pacific, and he used them as the basis of his stories. London's first short story was called An Old Soldier Story. Now, we need to remember that his stepfather, the man from whom he adopted the name London, was a disabled Civil War soldier. No mystery about his source material there. And by the way, London's birth name was John Griffith Cheney. London's first novel was about 8 years after his first short story, and it was called The Cruise of the Dazzler. No mystery there either. As I mentioned, the Razzle Dazzle was the name of the boat his black foster mother helped him buy. Write what you know meant something to Jack London. But first, he had to live a life of substance to be able to capture all the important moments he put on paper. So here's the tip. Don't just dream up stories. Go out and have genuine experiences. Have life-challenging or life-changing experiences and write about them. Sure, embellish them with your creativity as London did, but remember his writing was rooted in real people and events. That's primarily what Jack London did. The second tip that we can glean comes from his work. We see that he was not afraid to expand beyond his naturalistic view. As I mentioned, he was a journalist covering a war for a time. He also wrote plays and poems. Most people don't realize it, but Jack London pioneered science fiction in America. He wrote about germ warfare in one story, about an energy weapon in another, and about men encountering a prehistoric mammoth in yet another. His story, The Shadow and the Flash, was about achieving invisibility. Now, these were written in the early 1900s. The tip? Well, branch out, try new genres, leave your comfort zone, challenge yourself. There is no question that London fictionalized his real-life experiences for the most successful portion of his career, but he later branched out. Jack London did have specific tips for writers. He offered them to a New York magazine in 1904. They are so commonplace that I almost didn't include them. Here is his list with my commentary. Jack London said, "Work. Don't wait for some good Samaritan to tell you, but dig it out for yourself." This is self-evident, isn't it? I've been mentoring writers for decades, and a common theme is that these people are always complaining about not having an idea or that they have so-called writer's block. Sometimes I wonder if these people are writers. True writers have stories gushing out of them. Jack London says work. Yes, there is no substitute for that. Jack London said in this magazine, "Fiction pays best of all." I love this one. Jack London, the grand socialist, economic equality for all, was not above becoming a rich man himself. Some say he was obsessed with getting rich, whether it be in the gold fields of the Yukon or the publishing houses of New York City. So much for socialism. Failing writers often say they are not interested in making money. They often give away their books. Jack London would say such ideas are foolish. Go where the money is. That was the real credo of his life. Jack London said, "Don't write too much. Don't dash off a 6,000-word story before breakfast." I gotta say, this is odd to me. Jack London had to be a reasonably fast writer to account for all the short stories, novels, and plays he wrote in his short 22-year career. He wrote 23 novels, 3 autobiographical memoirs, 125 short stories, 22 nonfiction pieces and essays, and about 40 published poems and 3 plays, all that in 22 years. So London was prolific. I'm not sure what he meant when he said, "Don't dash off a 6,000-word story before breakfast." He probably meant, "Don't dash off a 6,000-word story before lunch." Today, we must learn to write quality material quickly. As Jack London demonstrated, high productivity is important. Jack London said, "Avoid the unhappy ending, the harsh, the brutal, the tragic, the horrible, if you care to see in print the things you write." Well, he had plenty of harsh, brutal, and tragic elements in his writing. That's part of what makes his stories so captivating. London believed a positive outcome was required, and I believe that's still true today. Finally, Jack London said, "Keep a notebook. Travel with it, eat with it, sleep with it, slap into it every stray thought that flutters up into your brain." Of course, this is old, wise advice offered by almost all successful writers. Just do it. Sadly, London did not follow his own advice about observing and recording situations in the last years of his life. It's said that he bought plot outlines from budding novelist Sinclair Lewis. London was also accused of plagiarism more than once because he based stories on news clippings but did not transform them enough to make them unique. The tip is that new writers either keep notebooks and write out of their own unique experience, or that they learn how to transform existing content to make it their own. Let me say that I have been rediscovering Jack London. Many young people read his novels and short stories in school, but you can enjoy them again as an adult. Personally, I've been listening to audiobook versions of The Call of the Wild and White Fang. There are also collections of his short stories in audiobook form. They make exciting listening. Have a great writing day.